June 14, 1944, the morning sun burned through the Norman hedgerows, casting long shadows across the muddy field where Oberfeldwebel Klaus Steiner sat motionless in the commander's cupola of his Tiger tank. 8 days after the Allied invasion at Normandy, his crew had been promised air superiority by the Luftwaffe. They had been assured that German engineering and tactical doctrine would neutralize any advantage the Allies might possess. What Klaus heard in that moment, a distant growl growing rapidly into a shrieking howl, would shatter every assurance he had received in 3 years of armored warfare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He looked up. Four dark silhouettes emerged from the coastal haze, flying lower than he thought possible, their wings carrying something that looked wrong, bulky pods that didn't belong on fighter aircraft. The lead aircraft banked slightly, and Klaus saw the distinctive shape he had been trained to dismiss as inferior, a Hawker Typhoon, the British fighter bomber that Luftwaffe briefings had called sluggish and vulnerable. But these Typhoons weren't engaging in dogfights. They were coming straight at his position with mechanical precision that spoke of practiced routine rather than desperate gamble. His gunner, Franz, shouted something about aircraft, but Klaus was already counting in his head. He had fought Soviet tanks at Kursk, had survived ambushes in the Ukraine, had learned to calculate angles and distances with the cold precision that kept men alive in armored warfare. His mind performed the calculation automatically. Distance, closing speed, angle of approach. 4 seconds. Maybe 5 if the pilots hesitated. That was all the time he had between recognition and impact. The Tiger beneath him represented the pinnacle of German armored engineering, 56 tons of steel and firepower that could engage enemy tanks at ranges they couldn't hope to match. Its 88mm gun had destroyed countless Sherman and T-34 tanks. Its armor, when properly angled, could deflect most anti-tank rounds then in service. Klaus and his crew had been taught that they operated the most formidable land weapon in existence, that their training and equipment made them masters of any battlefield they entered. The rockets launched with a sound Klaus had never heard before, a violent whoosh that seemed to tear the air itself. 8 trails of white smoke arced toward his position, and in that instant, every lesson about armor superiority and tactical invincibility evaporated. The RP-3 rockets, each carrying a 60-pound warhead, didn't need precision. They needed only proximity to a target that couldn't evade, couldn't deflect, and couldn't survive what was coming. Klaus Steiner had joined the Panzer forces in 1941, part of the generation that witnessed Germany's armored victories across Poland, France, and the early Soviet campaigns. The Panzer Arm represented the technological and tactical superiority that German military doctrine had promised would secure victory. Young men like Klaus received training that emphasized not just technical proficiency but ideological certainty. They were the elite, operating machines that embodied German engineering excellence and martial superiority. The Tiger tank entered service in late 1942, deployed first on the Eastern Front where it achieved immediate psychological and tactical impact. Soviet tank crews learned to fear its appearance, and German propaganda eagerly promoted the Tiger as an invincible weapon that would turn the tide of armored warfare. Klaus received his assignment to a Tiger crew in early 1943, after proving himself capable in the older Panzer Mark IV. The promotion came with increased prestige and absolute confidence in his vehicle's capabilities. Training on the Tiger emphasized its advantages over all contemporary opponent tanks. The instructors at the Panzer training grounds near Paderborn drilled into every crew member the technical specifications that made their vehicle superior. The 88mm KWK-36 gun could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The frontal armor, 100mm thick and carefully angled, could resist most anti-tank weapons then deployed by Soviet or Western Allied forces. The Maybach engine, despite its fuel consumption and mechanical complexity, provided adequate mobility for a vehicle of such mass. More importantly, the tactical doctrine surrounding Tiger deployment reinforced notions of invincibility. Tigers operated as breakthrough weapons, concentrated at critical points where their firepower and protection could shatter enemy formations. They were to be supported by infantry, screened by lighter panzers, and protected from close assault by combined arms coordination. In this doctrinal framework, the Tiger existed as the apex predator of armored combat, vulnerable only to massed artillery or catastrophic mechanical failure. Klaus and his crew, which included his gunner Franz Richter, driver Otto Baumann, loader Heinrich Weber, and radio operator Peter Koch, had functioned together for 16 months by June 1944. They had survived the brutal fighting around Kursk in July 1943, where Tigers proved their worth against Soviet armor but also revealed their limitations in sustained operations. Mechanical breakdowns plagued the Tiger force during that offensive, with more vehicles lost to engine failures and transmission problems than to enemy action. Still, when the Tiger functioned properly and operated within its design parameters, it dominated any armored engagement. The crew developed the tight coordination essential for tank warfare. Franz could identify targets and estimate ranges with remarkable accuracy, translating Klaus's commands into precise gun laying. Otto learned the Tiger's handling characteristics, understanding how to position the massive vehicle to maximize armor protection while maintaining fields of fire. Heinrich mastered the brutal physical labor of handling 88mm ammunition in the confines of the fighting compartment, maintaining a rate of fire that kept their gun in action. Peter managed communications with company headquarters while assisting with target observation and ammunition handling. Their confidence grew through successful engagements. In the winter of 1943 and spring of 1944, Klaus's Tiger destroyed 11 confirmed enemy tanks, earning him the Tank Destruction Badge and consideration for the Iron Cross First Class. Each successful engagement reinforced the lessons of training. Proper positioning, disciplined fire control, and exploitation of the Tiger's advantages produced victories that seemed to validate everything they had been taught about armored warfare. The reassignment to France in May 1944 came with briefings that acknowledged Allied invasion preparations but maintained confidence in German ability to repel any landing. The panzer divisions positioned behind the Atlantic Wall, including Klaus's unit, would counterattack any beachhead and drive the invaders back into the sea. Luftwaffe officers assured them of air support that would protect ground forces from aerial interference. The German fighter force, they were told, retained sufficient strength to contest Allied air superiority and prevent the kind of aerial interdiction that had complicated operations in Sicily and Italy. These assurances proved hollow within hours of the Normandy landings. On June 6, Klaus's company received orders to move toward the invasion beaches, but the movement became a nightmare of aerial attacks and disrupted communications. Allied fighter bombers appeared whenever German columns moved during daylight, forcing movement into night hours and creating delays that prevented timely concentration of armor. The promised Luftwaffe support materialized only sporadically, and when German fighters did appear, they seemed overwhelmed by the numbers and coordination of Allied air power. By June 14, Klaus's Tiger occupied a defensive position near the town of Villers-Bocage, part of a broader effort to contain the expanding Allied beachhead. The past week had taught harsh lessons about vulnerability to air attack. The crew had witnessed trucks burning on roadsides, supply columns scattered by strafing runs, and infantry formations forced to disperse whenever aircraft appeared. Still, the Tiger itself had not yet been directly engaged by aircraft. Its armor seemed adequate against machine gun fire, and the dive-bombing attacks they had observed appeared inaccurate against moving or dispersed targets. The morning of June 14 began with routine maintenance and preparation for possible movement. Klaus stood in the commander's cupola conducting a visual sweep of the surrounding terrain when he first heard the approaching aircraft. The sound differed from previous encounters with Allied planes. These weren't the high-altitude bombers that occasionally appeared overhead, nor the swift fighters that might strafe targets of opportunity. The engine note suggested something larger than a fighter but lower and slower than he expected from bomber formations. Franz spotted them first, calling out aircraft approaching from the northwest at extremely low altitude. Klaus swung his binoculars toward the indicated direction and immediately recognized the threat. For Hawker Typhoons in line-astern formation, perhaps 300 meters altitude, flying directly toward his position. The bulky pods beneath their wings identified them as carrying the rocket projectiles that intelligence reports had mentioned but which Klaus had never personally encountered. The Typhoon had entered Royal Air Force service in 1941, initially intended as a high-altitude interceptor but proving more valuable in ground attack roles. Its thick wings could carry substantial weapon loads, and its rugged construction allowed it to absorb battle damage and continue operating. By 1944, specialized Typhoon squadrons had developed tactics for attacking German armor using the RP-3 rocket, a 60-pound warhead mounted on a 3-inch solid-fuel rocket motor. German intelligence had tracked the development and deployment of rocket-armed Typhoons with increasing concern throughout 1943 and early 1944. Reports from Italy and later from France documented their effectiveness against various targets including vehicles, buildings, and locomotives. However, the Panzer crews received limited information about the specific threat these weapons posed to heavy tanks. The briefings Klaus had attended mentioned rocket-armed aircraft but emphasized that proper spacing and air defense coordination would minimize risk. Standing in his cupola that morning, Klaus realized that spacing and air defense coordination meant nothing when 4 Typhoons approached his isolated position with clear attack intent. His Tiger sat in a small clearing surrounded by Norman hedgerows, positioned for tactical advantage against ground threats but offering no concealment from aerial observation. The nearest anti-aircraft support was with the regimental headquarters 2 kilometers distant. His own machine guns could engage aircraft, but the Typhoons were already beginning their attack run before he could issue fire commands. The physics of the engagement worked entirely in favor of the attacking aircraft. The Typhoon's approach speed of approximately 600 km per hour meant it closed the initial sighting distance of roughly 2 kilometers in 12 seconds. The pilots would begin their firing sequence at approximately 800 meters, giving Klaus perhaps 4 seconds from rocket launch to impact. In that time span, his crew could neither evacuate the vehicle nor maneuver it sufficiently to evade the attack. The Tiger's advantages in armor protection and firepower meant nothing against a threat arriving from above at speeds that made response impossible. Klaus shouted warnings to his crew, ordering them to button up all hatches, but he knew the gesture was futile. The Tiger's upper armor, designed to resist plunging artillery fire and tank rounds, measured only 25 mm on the engine deck and 40 mm on the turret roof. These thicknesses could stop small arms fire and shell fragments but offered minimal protection against weapons designed to penetrate significantly heavier armor. The RP-3 60-pound warhead, though not specifically designed as an anti-tank weapon, delivered explosive force that could catastrophically damage any part of the Tiger it struck. He watched the lead Typhoon's wings light up as the rockets launched, 8 trails of white smoke reaching toward his position like fingers of an inexorable hand. The sound reached him a fraction of a second later, a tearing shriek that seemed to split the morning air. His mind, trained through years of combat to calculate trajectories and odds, understood instantly that no action he could take in the remaining seconds would matter. The Tiger that had made him feel invincible now trapped him in a steel coffin waiting for destruction he couldn't prevent or survive. The first rocket struck the ground 15 meters short of the Tiger, the warhead detonating in the soft Norman earth and sending up a geyser of mud and debris. The second hit the front glassy plate, the one area of the Tiger theoretically capable of resisting such an impact, and the warhead exploded against armor that deflected most of the blast. The third rocket missed entirely, passing over the turret to explode harmlessly in the hedgerow beyond. But the fourth rocket found the engine deck. The explosion that followed wasn't the dramatic fireball Klaus had seen when ammunition-laden vehicles were struck. Instead, the 60-pound warhead punched through the relatively thin deck armor and detonated inside the engine compartment. The blast wrecked the Maybach engine, severed fuel lines, and ignited the auxiliary fuel tanks. Fire erupted immediately, and Klaus felt the Tiger lurch as something in the drivetrain failed catastrophically. Black smoke began pouring from the engine deck, and he heard Franz screaming something about bailing out. The remaining 3 Typhoons followed in their attack runs, adding their rockets to the assault. Most missed or struck without penetrating critical areas, but one more rocket found the turret, hitting the junction between turret and hull and jamming the traverse mechanism. Another penetrated the thinner side armor, though it failed to fully detonate and caused less damage than it might have. In less than 30 seconds, for aircraft had reduced Klaus's Tiger from a fearsome weapon to a burning wreck that his crew was desperately trying to escape. Klaus hauled himself from the commander's cupola, the thick smoke making it difficult to see or breathe. He could hear his crew scrambling to exit through any available hatch as flames spread through the engine compartment toward the fighting compartment. Otto emerged from the driver's hatch, his face blackened by smoke. Franz and Heinrich followed Klaus out of the turret hatches, and Peter crawled out last, coughing violently from smoke inhalation. All 5 men stumbled away from their Tiger as flames consumed the engine compartment and began spreading toward the ammunition storage. They ran across the open field toward a distant tree line, expecting at any moment to feel machine gun bullets from the circling Typhoons. But the aircraft had already broken off their attack, climbing away to seek other targets. The pilots had expended their rockets and saw no reason to waste cannon ammunition on fleeing crew members. Klaus and his men reached cover just as the Tiger's ammunition began cooking off, the turret ammunition storage detonating in a series of explosions that blew the turret completely off the hull and sent it tumbling several meters away. Klaus stood in the shelter of the trees, watching the Tiger burn. 3 years of training, 16 months of combat operations, 11 confirmed victories, all the confidence built through technological superiority and tactical doctrine, destroyed in 4 seconds by weapons launched from aircraft his briefings had dismissed as manageable threats. The Typhoons were already small specks in the distance, presumably seeking other targets, while his crew stood shaking from adrenaline and smoke inhalation, alive only because the rockets had given them just enough time to escape before the vehicle became their tomb. The gunner Franz spoke first, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Those rockets, we had no chance. Nothing we could do." His statement reflected what all 5 men understood in that moment. The Tiger's armor superiority, the doctrine of combined arms protection, the assurances about Luftwaffe support, all the elements that had made them confident in their invincibility, had proven meaningless against a threat they couldn't counter. An aircraft they had been trained to consider inferior had destroyed their invincible tank in the time it took to draw 4 breaths. Heinrich, the loader who had handled hundreds of 88mm rounds in combat, simply sat down heavily against a tree trunk. Otto, the driver who had maneuvered the Tiger through numerous engagements, stared at the burning wreck with an expression Klaus couldn't quite read. Peter, youngest of the crew at barely 20 years old, was crying quietly, whether from relief at survival or shock at their narrow escape, Klaus couldn't tell. Klaus himself felt something fundamental shift in his understanding. He had survived tank combat on the Eastern Front, had seen Tigers destroyed by Soviet anti-tank guns and massed artillery, had experienced mechanical breakdowns that left vehicles helpless. But those threats existed within the framework of armored warfare as he understood it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tanks destroyed other tanks, artillery threatened exposed vehicles, mechanical failures reflected the Tiger's complex engineering. These were risks inherent to the domain of ground combat between roughly matched forces. The Typhoons represented something different, a threat that operated outside the rules of engagement he had internalized. They attacked from a dimension his training had barely addressed, at speeds that made response impossible, with weapons that negated armor advantages, and with impunity granted by Allied air superiority. His Tiger hadn't been outfought in a tactical sense. It had simply been erased by an enemy operating in a domain where German forces no longer held any meaningful capability to resist. As the 5 men began the long walk back toward their company position, Klaus reflected on what the past 8 days since the invasion had revealed. The Luftwaffe wasn't providing air cover because it couldn't. The promised counterattacks kept failing because armored columns couldn't move during daylight without being destroyed by aircraft like the Typhoons that had just killed his tank. The tactical and technological advantages that made Tigers dominant in ground combat meant nothing when the enemy controlled the sky absolutely and used that control to attack with weapons the panzer forces couldn't defend against. The Americans and British had built an air force so numerous and well-equipped that German fighters couldn't contest their control of airspace over the battlefield. This wasn't a temporary situation or a local advantage. It reflected industrial capacity and logistical capability that dwarfed what Germany could field. The Typhoons that destroyed his Tiger weren't exceptional or rare weapons. They were standard equipment in squadrons that could appear over any part of the battlefield, attacking German armor with casual efficiency while Luftwaffe interference remained minimal or absent. Klaus had been taught that German engineering and tactical excellence would overcome Allied numerical advantages. The Tiger embodied this confidence, a quality weapon operated by trained crews following proven doctrine. But numbers mattered when they reached the scale the Allies had achieved. For Typhoons had destroyed his Tiger in one pass. How many Typhoons did the British have? How many similar aircraft were the Americans operating? If every Tiger in Normandy faced the same threat without effective counter, what chance did the Panzer forces have of containing the invasion? These thoughts troubled Klaus as his crew walked through the Norman countryside toward what remained of their unit. The burning Tiger behind them represented more than the loss of one vehicle. It symbolized the collapse of assumptions that had sustained German confidence since the beginning of the war. Superior quality couldn't overcome overwhelming quantity when that quantity came supported by industrial capacity that could afford to waste resources German forces carefully husbanded. The chocolate and cigarettes he had heard American soldiers possessed in abundance seemed less trivial when connected to an industrial system that could also produce aircraft and weapons in numbers that made individual German advantages meaningless. By late afternoon, Klaus and his crew reached what remained of their company. Of the 12 Tigers that had deployed to Normandy, only 5 remained operational. 4 had been destroyed by aircraft in attacks similar to what Klaus had experienced. 2 had suffered mechanical breakdowns and been abandoned during retreat movements. 1 had been knocked out by anti-tank guns during an engagement with British armor. The company commander, a career officer who had fought in Poland and France, looked older than his 40 years as he processed Klaus's report of the Typhoon attack. The commander's response surprised Klaus with its bitterness. The Luftwaffe promised U.S. air cover. The High Command assured us we could counterattack effectively. Instead, we lose tanks every time we move during daylight, and when we do engage Allied armor, their aircraft arrive within minutes to intervene. We can't win this battle. We're just waiting here to be destroyed piece by piece. This admission from a senior officer shattered another layer of Klaus's confidence. If experienced commanders recognized the impossibility of their situation, if the tactical hopelessness was obvious to those directing operations, then what purpose remained in continuing? The propaganda had promised final victory, had insisted that German willpower and military excellence would triumph over Allied material advantages. The reality Klaus had experienced that morning suggested instead that material advantages at the scale the Allies possessed made willpower and excellence irrelevant. That night, lying in a barn his company was using for shelter, Klaus replayed the morning's events continuously in his mind. 4 seconds. The time between recognizing the threat and feeling his Tiger destroyed beneath him. 4 seconds in which all his training, all his combat experience, all the supposed advantages of his vehicle and crew had proven utterly worthless. 4 seconds that revealed the enormous gap between what German propaganda claimed and what Allied industrial might could actually achieve. The Typhoon pilots who had attacked his position would return to their base, reload with rockets, and attack other targets that afternoon or the next day. The aircraft he had destroyed, if any, could be replaced from production lines that apparently operated without the material constraints limiting German industry. The rockets they had fired, each requiring precision manufacturing and specialized components, were expended casually as if their supply was endless. This casual abundance in the conduct of warfare itself demonstrated advantages that went far beyond simple numerical superiority. Franz Richter couldn't sleep that night in the barn, not because of fear but because of something more disturbing, the quiet certainty that everything he had believed about their war had been constructed on foundations that were crumbling faster than anyone wanted to admit. He lay on the straw watching shadows from a single candle dance across the wooden beams overhead, listening to the distant rumble of explosions that marked another Allied bombardment. Somewhere out there, more Tigers were probably burning, more crews were discovering what he and Klaus had learned that morning. The invincible machine they had trusted with their lives could be destroyed by weapons they had no capacity to counter. The next morning brought orders to withdraw further inland, another tactical retreat disguised as repositioning. Klaus assembled his crew to inform them they would be assigned a replacement Tiger from the reserve pool, but the announcement met with silence rather than relief. Otto, who normally took pride in his driving skills, simply nodded without expression. Heinrich asked no questions about the new vehicle's condition or ammunition load. Peter, the radio operator who usually chatted nervously before operations, stared at his boots. They all understood that a new Tiger merely meant a new target for the next Typhoon patrol. The replacement vehicle arrived 2 days later, driven by a delivery crew who looked exhausted and anxious to return to rear areas before daylight brought more aircraft. The Tiger appeared mechanically sound, freshly painted in camouflage patterns that wouldn't matter to pilots attacking from above. Klaus inspected it with professional thoroughness, checking systems and equipment, but the examination felt hollow. He was verifying the functionality of a weapon system he now knew was obsolete not because of any flaw in its design but because the war itself had moved beyond the domain where its advantages mattered. During the inspection, Klaus noticed modifications that hadn't been present on their previous Tiger. Additional steel plates had been welded to the engine deck in a crude attempt to provide extra protection against aerial attack. The reinforcement added perhaps 10 millimeters of steel, enough to stop machine gun fire but utterly inadequate against rocket warheads. Still, someone in the maintenance section had spent hours welding these plates in place, a desperate gesture that revealed how thoroughly the Panzer forces understood their vulnerability. Even the mechanics knew that German armor was being hunted to extinction by aircraft they couldn't fight. The crew spent that afternoon conducting movement drills with their new Tiger, relearning its particular handling characteristics and quirks. Every tank had individual variations in steering, engine response, and gun traverse that crews needed to master. But the practice felt like a charade. Otto could learn every subtlety of the transmission, Franz could perfect his gun-laying technique, Heinrich could achieve faster reload times, and none of it would matter when the Typhoons arrived. Their training prepared them for tank warfare, for engagements where skill and coordination made the difference between victory and death. Against air attack, all their skill meant nothing. That evening, a Luftwaffe liaison officer visited the company command post, ostensibly to coordinate air support requests. Klaus happened to be present for a briefing and witnessed the confrontation that followed. The company commander asked directly about fighter protection for daylight movements. The Luftwaffe officer, a captain with decorations from the Eastern Front, provided answers that avoided the question. Resources were stretched thin, he explained. The Reich was defending against bomber raids on the homeland while supporting operations across multiple theaters. Priority allocations went to the most critical sectors. Daylight fighter sweeps would occur when concentration of forces permitted. Klaus watched his commander's face redden as the evasions continued. Finally, the senior officer interrupted. "Stop lying to us, Captain. We all know the Luftwaffe can't provide air cover because it doesn't have enough aircraft, enough fuel, or enough pilots to contest Allied air superiority. Every man in this company has watched enemy planes operate overhead without interference. We've been attacked repeatedly without seeing a single German fighter. Just tell us the truth. Are we supposed to fight this battle without any protection from air attack?" The Luftwaffe captain's expression shifted from defensive to something closer to despair. He was younger than Klaus had initially thought, perhaps not yet 30, and the question seemed to strip away the official evasions he had been trained to provide. "The truth, Herr Major, is that we're outnumbered 10-1 in this sector. We lose aircraft faster than they can be replaced. The pilots we have are flying multiple sorties daily until they're killed or too exhausted to continue. The Americans and British have so many aircraft that they can afford to assign entire squadrons just to hunt our tanks. We can't stop them. We can barely survive them." The admission hung in the air of the command post like smoke from a grenade. Several officers present, veterans of campaigns where Luftwaffe support had been reliable or at least present, heard their assumptions shattered as clearly as Klaus had when the rockets launched. The captain continued, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "The High Command won't admit it publicly, but this invasion cannot be stopped with the forces we have available. The Allies control the air completely. They can see every movement we make and attack at will. They're destroying our armor faster than it can be replaced or even brought forward. This battle is already lost. We're just fighting now because retreat isn't authorized. Klaus left the command post before the meeting concluded, not wanting to hear more confirmations of what he already understood. He found his crew gathered near their new Tiger, smoking cigarettes someone had scavenged from a supply truck. They looked up as he approached, and he saw in their faces the same knowledge that burdened him. They weren't stupid. They could count aircraft overhead and note the absence of German fighters. They could see the burned-out wrecks of vehicles along every road. They understood the mathematics of attrition even if no one spoke it aloud. Franz broke the silence first. How long do you think we have before it happens again? Before another typhoon finds us and we get another 4 seconds to realize we're about to die? Klaus had no answer that wouldn't demoralize them further. Instead, he shared what the Luftwaffe captain had admitted, the acknowledgement that air superiority was completely lost and wouldn't be regained. His crew received this information with resignation rather than surprise. Otto observed that they had already figured out the Luftwaffe wasn't coming to help. Heinrich noted that at least now they knew the truth instead of hoping for support that would never arrive. Peter, the youngest, asked the question none of them wanted to confront. So what do we do? Just wait here until rockets kill us? The question had no good answer. Military discipline required them to follow orders, maintain their position, and engage Allied forces as directed. Personal survival suggested abandoning the Tiger and disappearing into the French countryside, but desertion carried execution if caught, and more importantly, violated the bonds of loyalty that held military units together. They were trapped between duty that demanded they continue fighting a battle they couldn't win and self-preservation that urged them to flee before the next Typhoon patrol found them. Klaus made a decision that he suspected many other tank commanders were making in those days. We'll do our duty, but we won't throw our lives away for nothing. We'll fight when ordered, but we'll prioritize survival over heroics. If we can position the Tiger under cover that might protect us from air attack, we'll do so even if it compromises our tactical position against ground threats. If we're ordered into situations where air attack seems certain, we'll move at night and hide during day. We'll follow orders, but we'll interpret them to give ourselves the best chance of living through this. His crew nodded agreement, understanding the compromise he was proposing. They would remain soldiers rather than deserters, but they would no longer trust the tactical doctrine and strategic assurances that had already proven false. They would rely on their own judgment about what risks made sense and what orders essentially commanded suicide. It was a subtle form of rebellion that maintained the appearance of discipline while prioritizing survival over the mission objectives that High Command still insisted were achievable. Over the following week, Klaus's approach proved prescient as his company continued to lose Tigers to air attack despite attempting to follow proper doctrine. Another crew was caught during a daylight repositioning movement and destroyed by rocket-firing Typhoons before they could reach cover. A third Tiger was hit during what should have been a concealed position, located by reconnaissance aircraft and struck by fighter bombers that appeared with disturbing speed. The surviving crews began adopting similar survival strategies, maximizing concealment even at the cost of tactical effectiveness, refusing daylight movement regardless of orders, and generally conducting operations as if German air support didn't exist, because it didn't. The psychological toll of this sustained vulnerability manifested in various ways among the tank crews. Some men became fatalistic, accepting their likely death and focusing only on taking as many enemies with them as possible before the inevitable occurred. Others grew increasingly paranoid, seeing threats in every aircraft silhouette and diving for cover at the slightest engine sound. A few began showing signs of complete breakdown, unable to function in their crew positions due to overwhelming anxiety about the next air attack. Klaus noticed these symptoms in his own crew and in himself. Otto developed a nervous habit of constantly scanning the sky even when inside the Tiger with hatches closed. Franz's hands shook slightly when loading the main gun, a tremor that hadn't been present before the first Typhoon attack. Heinrich startled violently at unexpected sounds, his body conditioned to associate sudden noise with incoming rockets. Peter had nightmares that woke him screaming about aircraft and fire, dreams that probably mirrored what they all experienced but didn't discuss. The arrival of a new officer to replace casualties in the company leadership brought fresh perspective that somehow made their situation seem even worse. Hauptmann Werner Vogel had been transferred from the Eastern Front after recovering from wounds received during the Soviet summer offensive. He had fought in some of the war's most brutal armor engagements, had seen Tigers in action against Soviet tanks, and brought with him the confidence of someone who had survived the Eastern Front's meat grinder. That confidence lasted approximately 3 days before Normandy's reality destroyed it. Werner participated in a short local counterattack intended to push back a British advance, an operation that would have been routine on the Eastern Front. The attacking force consisted of 4 Tigers and supporting infantry, advancing through terrain that offered good fields of fire against enemy armor. The attack proceeded according to plan for roughly 15 minutes, engaging British tanks at long range and achieving several kills. Then the Typhoons arrived. Klaus watched from his concealed position as the 4 attacking Tigers were systematically destroyed in less than 5 minutes. The British ground forces had clearly radioed for air support the moment German armor appeared, and the response time demonstrated coordination that Klaus found both impressive and terrifying. The Typhoons arrived in 2 waves of 4 aircraft each, attacking from different angles to ensure at least one element would have clear lines on the Tigers regardless of their positioning. They launched their rockets from ranges that made defensive fire impossible and pressed their attacks with professional efficiency that suggested extensive training and combat experience. All 4 Tigers were hit, 3 destroyed outright and the 4th immobilized and abandoned by its crew. The supporting infantry scattered under strafing fire from the Typhoon's cannons after they had expended their rockets. The entire counterattack collapsed in the time it took for 8 aircraft to make their attack runs. British ground forces barely had to engage, merely waiting while their air support eliminated the German armor that threatened them. It was combined arms warfare at a level of effectiveness that rendered conventional ground tactics obsolete. Werner returned from observing the disaster with an expression Klaus recognized from his own mirror. The captain sat heavily on an ammunition crate and stared at nothing for several minutes before speaking. "I've seen Soviet artillery destroy entire companies," he finally said. "I've watched T-34s overwhelm positions through sheer numbers. I've experienced the worst the Eastern Front could offer. But this is different. At least in the East we could fight back, could use our advantages to counter theirs. Here, we just die. There's no tactical response to an enemy who can call down destruction from the sky faster than we can react." The captain's assessment spread through the company as veteran crews shared their own experiences, confirming his observation. The Normandy battlefield operated under rules completely different from the Eastern Front. In the East, Tigers could exploit their range and armor advantages, could position for ambush, could rely on combined arms support that actually functioned. In Normandy, none of those advantages mattered because Allied air power negated them all. Positioning didn't matter when reconnaissance aircraft spotted every German unit. Range advantages meant nothing when rockets struck from above. Combined arms support couldn't function when every element of German forces faced the same overwhelming aerial threat. Klaus found himself in the strange position of educating an officer more senior and experienced than himself about the realities of their situation. He explained the tactical adjustments crews had adopted to maximize survival, the refusal to move during daylight, the prioritization of concealment over tactical positioning, the understanding that following conventional doctrine meant certain death. Werner listened with the attentiveness of someone recognizing truth he didn't want to accept but couldn't deny. The captain asked the question Klaus had been avoiding. "How long can we sustain this? If we're reduced to hiding during day and making only limited movements at night, we can't accomplish any tactical objectives. We can't counterattack, can't defend effectively, can't even maintain our positions. We're just trying to survive until we're killed anyway." Klaus had thought about this extensively during the sleepless nights that followed his Tiger's destruction. The honest answer is we can't sustain it. Every day we lose more tanks, more crews, more capability. The replacements that arrive are insufficient to make up losses, and the new crews are less experienced and die faster. Unless the Luftwaffe can somehow regain air superiority, which everyone knows won't happen, or unless the Allies stop their advance, which seems unlikely given their advantages, We're going to be ground down to nothing. We're already defeated. We just haven't admitted it yet. This conversation occurred in late June 1944, roughly 3 weeks after the initial invasion. In those 3 weeks, Klaus's company had lost 8 of its 12 Tigers, 5 to air attack, 2 to mechanical failure, and 1 to anti-tank fire during the brief counterattack. Replacement vehicles arrived sporadically, never enough to restore full strength, and the replacement crews often lacked adequate training or experience. The company that had confidently expected to drive Allied forces back into the sea now fought desperately just to maintain its positions against an enemy who seemed to have unlimited resources and uncontested ability to employ them. The broader tactical situation matched what Klaus's company experienced. German armor across the Normandy front suffered devastating losses to Allied air attack, with some panzer divisions losing over half their tank strength within the first month of combat. The carefully planned counterattacks that doctrine dictated couldn't be executed because daylight movement brought immediate airstrikes that destroyed formations before they could engage enemy ground forces. The defensive positions that German forces did manage to establish couldn't be supplied or reinforced effectively because Allied aircraft interdicted supply routes and targeted anything that moved during daylight. Statistical analysis conducted after the war would reveal the scale of Allied air dominance during the Normandy campaign. Allied air forces flew over 200,000 sorties during June and July 1944, while the Luftwaffe managed barely 5,000. Allied fighter bombers destroyed or damaged over 2,000 German armored vehicles during the same period, with air attack accounting for more German armor losses than ground combat. The 4 seconds that Klaus had experienced between recognizing the Typhoon threat and feeling his Tiger destroyed represented the median engagement time for successful rocket attacks against German armor throughout the campaign. What made this air dominance particularly devastating was its consistency and sustainability. The Allied air forces weren't executing occasional devastating raids followed by quiet periods for recovery. They operated continuously, maintaining pressure that never allowed German forces to move, resupply, or reorganize without facing immediate attack. This sustained operational tempo reflected industrial and logistical capabilities that German forces couldn't match or counter. The Allies could afford to fly thousands of sorties weekly because they had thousands of aircraft, unlimited fuel, and production capacity that replaced losses faster than combat could inflict them. Klaus experienced this relentless pressure personally in early July when his company received orders to relocate to a new defensive sector. The movement, which should have required perhaps 6 hours during daylight, instead stretched across 3 nights and required elaborate concealment procedures during day. The company moved in small groups, no more than 2 Tigers together, traveling only on secondary roads where tree cover might provide concealment from aerial observation. Each dawn found them scrambling to camouflage their vehicles and establish covered positions before Allied reconnaissance aircraft began their morning patrols. Despite these precautions, they lost another Tiger during the movement. The vehicle suffered a mechanical breakdown that delayed it past dawn, leaving it exposed when daylight arrived. The crew attempted to camouflage it hastily, but Allied reconnaissance spotted the Tiger within 2 hours. The subsequent airstrike destroyed the immobilized vehicle and killed 2 crew members who couldn't escape quickly enough. The survivors reached Klaus's position that evening, and their account of the attack differed little from the dozens of similar incidents that had occurred across the front. The Typhoons had arrived perhaps 30 minutes after the reconnaissance aircraft departed, launched their rockets with practiced efficiency, and departed before German anti-aircraft fire could engage them effectively. This pattern of aerial reconnaissance followed by rapid strike demonstrated coordination and communication capabilities that impressed Klaus despite their deadly implications for German forces. The Allied system allowed aircraft to locate targets, transmit coordinates, and direct attacks within time frames that gave German units no opportunity to relocate or prepare defenses. It represented information warfare at a level of sophistication that German forces couldn't match, enabled by radio systems more reliable than what German units possessed and by a command structure that apparently empowered relatively junior personnel to make tactical decisions without waiting for authorization from distant headquarters. The contrast with German operational procedures couldn't have been starker. Klaus's company operated under rigid command structures that required authorization for most tactical decisions from officers often located kilometers away and sometimes out of communication contact. German radio equipment, while technically capable, suffered from reliability issues and limited range that complicated coordination. The Luftwaffe's inability to provide reconnaissance support meant German commanders often lacked current information about Allied positions or movements, forcing them to operate with incomplete intelligence while their opponents apparently tracked German dispositions continuously. These systematic advantages, the reliable communications, the effective reconnaissance, the rapid response times, the sustained operational tempo, all flowed from industrial and logistical superiority that manifested in countless small ways beyond the obvious numerical advantages in aircraft and vehicles. The Allies could afford redundant radio systems, could maintain reconnaissance coverage through overlapping aircraft patrols, could keep strike aircraft on alert for rapid response, and could sustain all of this continuously because their supply systems delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts with boring reliability. Klaus had learned in his first weeks of tank warfare that logistics ultimately determined tactical possibilities. A Tiger with empty fuel tanks and exhausted ammunition couldn't exploit its theoretical advantages over enemy armor. A well-supplied Sherman, despite its inferior gun and armor, remained more dangerous than an immobilized Tiger. The same principle applied at larger scales. Allied air forces that could sustain operations continuously because logistics supported them proved far more effective than the theoretically superior German aircraft that sat grounded for lack of fuel or parts. By mid-July, Klaus's company had been reduced to 3 operational Tigers and fewer than 20 crew members, less than a quarter of its authorized strength. The constant losses, the failed replacements, the accumulating stress of sustained vulnerability had transformed the unit from a confident fighting force into a collection of exhausted men waiting for death. They still followed orders, still moved when directed and fought when engaged, but the aggressive confidence that had characterized panzer operations in earlier campaigns had been replaced by grim fatalism. Werner, the captain whose Eastern Front experience had proven inadequate preparation for Normandy, seemed to age visibly during those weeks. He made decisions now with obvious awareness of their likely futility, issuing orders that he knew might result in more destroyed Tigers and dead crews but seeing no alternative that served the broader mission, however hopeless that mission appeared. During one evening conversation, he admitted to Klaus that he had recommended to regimental headquarters that remaining Tigers be withdrawn from forward positions and concentrated for a major counterattack rather than being consumed piecemeal by air attacks. His recommendation had been rejected with reminders about holding current positions and continuing to resist Allied advances. The captain's frustration reflected broader tensions within German command structures as the reality of defeat became undeniable to frontline units while higher headquarters continued to issue orders predicated on assumptions that no longer reflected actual conditions. Tank commanders who understood the futility of daylight operations received orders to conduct daylight attacks. Units that needed to consolidate and reorganize were instead ordered to hold exposed positions. The growing disconnect between battlefield reality and command expectations created situations where obeying orders meant accepting certain destruction while disobeying them risked court-martial. Klaus never faced this dilemma in its starkest form, but he watched it destroy other men. A company commander in a neighboring unit refused a direct order to conduct a daylight attack he deemed suicidal, was relieved of command and placed under arrest for cowardice. His replacement executed the ordered attack, lost every tank in the company, and was himself killed in the resulting disaster. The original commander was eventually executed by firing squad for disobedience, a punishment that seemed grotesque when his judgment had been proven correct by events. These incidents accumulated into a comprehensive picture of an army consuming itself, destroying its remaining strength through tactical futility while maintaining the fiction of effective resistance. The soldiers dying in Normandy understood this increasingly clearly, saw the gap between propaganda claims of successful defense and the reality of continuous retreat and mounting losses. The 4 seconds Klaus had experienced between recognition and destruction had revealed not just his immediate vulnerability but the broader strategic hopelessness of Germany's military position. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.